Hello. I'm here to talk a little bit, as far as I can, about my new book of poems, which is called One Little Room. And I think maybe the best way I can talk about it is simply to read a few of the poems and attempt to fill in what they might be doing in the context of the book, and indeed what the book itself might be trying to do. The title of the book, One Little Room, is taken from a very famous poem by John Donne, The Good Morrow, where Donne writes how love all love of other sights controls and makes one little room and everywhere, and makes one little room and everywhere. So there are many spaces in this book, small, confined if you like, whether rooms or boxes or jars, or stranger spaces that are imagined around and between those shapes. But the poem I'd like to start with is one that's set in memory, I expect, like many of my poems, but set in the memory of a shop, the shop, large furniture shop, and furnishing shop in Belfast Craigie Road in the 1970s, long ago. I've written about this shop before, actually. It was called Milligan's, and it was, as I said, on the Craigie Road. My mother used to work keeping the books part-time in a little office downstairs. There was a great big showroom, and above that showroom, with the view of the showroom, was the work space where the carpet fitter would prepare the carpets that he would take out and lay all across Belfast. I used to, in the school holidays, spend time up there, or make time pass watching what was going on downstairs, but also fiddling around, I dare say, with model kits and the like, whilst the carpet fitter, Ronnie, would get on from time to time with his work before loading up the van. So the poem, which comes from quite late in the new book, remembers the space there, remembers being in that space, remembers the work that went on there, and wonders how such work as a book of poems might constitute, how that might fit in with the real skill, the real work that goes on always, all around us. Anyway, the poem itself is named after the carpet fitter, who's a great fellow, and it's called Ronnie. I'll read it now. It was above the shop, but open so you could sit at one of the work tables and look down at the whole showroom beneath you, where furniture from a dozen living rooms seemed to have been arranged to face all the daylight coming through from the Craigie Road, where it rained and shone over one wall of glass. That's where the workshop was, with its big rounds of carpet and underlay, up to the roof, toolboxes put by or open, tape measures, guillotines to cut in straight lines, canisters, pots of glue, a board with dates and addresses, then ledgers that had sizes and shapes in against the lengths of rolls, a whole upstairs den you would hardly notice from down among the chairs and armchairs, sofas and deep pile rugs in the shop itself. It was here that Ronnie would work, or get ready to work, when he'd go out to fit square miles of carpet like lightning, and exactly every time. So well had it been planned and cut, in room after room after room, everywhere, all over Belfast. I used to sit with him while I fiddled with some Airfix kit, and he zipped ahead, precise and fast, ready to load up and get on. I thought that I was breathing in purpose and skill from being half hidden with a good view of everything below, and loved that air of know-how, though really I didn't have a clue about what I knew how to do. It was 50 years ago, more, and before long I was gone. Ronnie was gone, and Milligan's was gone too, with its furniture and carpets sent to nowhere. And the office downstairs on the left, where my mother kept the books, was gone, while the place to watch from, make things in, went inside, or sank down inside me like a lead weight, like ballast, to keep me straight but slow as I worked and worried out of sight, hutched in the dark, with light from one side to cover what was made. Unlike Ronnie, so sharp and so smart, he could finish 2 houses in one day. Those new carpets and underlay will look old, will have been thrown away. But now, in the lighted dark, I can smell them. I can breathe in work and readiness and quiet. It is all as still as still. Now, the different rooms in this book include quite a lot, I suppose, of other poets, other poetry, which is not a decision, but something that happens, I think, when you write, at least if you write long enough, and if you love enough poetry by others. Occasionally, though, new poets swim into my ken. And one of those, I think, in this book to be sensed and met with is the rather strange, not to say exotic, figure of a guy who went by the pen name of Saint-Jean Perse, who was in fact a French diplomat at one stage, a senior civil servant diplomat, and was engaged with Daladier in what became the Munich Agreement, and there are poems about that in the book. But he's best known still as the author of a poem called Anabas, or Anabasis, famously hard to understand poem, a poem which, let me say, I would not claim for one moment to be an expert on, but which I've enjoyed, and it's a poem, by the way, that was shortly after its publication translated by T.S. Eliot in an interesting way. A poem written in as some French poems tend to be, in prose. I have a couple of poems which I call paraphrases on Saint-Jean Perse, parts of Anabas, and the imp of the perverse in me, the formalist imp of the formalist perverse, made me render these not in prose but in verse. And I call them paraphrases, as I do other poems in this book, for example, the ones that relate to 2 of the Psalms. I call them paraphrases because they're a combination, really, of what's in the text and what is not in the text. I'm going to read a poem called Solitude, which features something that is not in the text of Anabas section 4, which is a gannet. It's a real enough gannet. It also features an egg, which is the wrong colour to be a gannet's egg, if you see what I mean. For these strangenesses, I myself am responsible, and not Saint-Jean Perse. This I've given the title of solitude. The gannet I found stranded in a car park, something all wrong with its wings, and its head too heavy for the neck to bear. Beautiful bird, beautiful ugly bird. Not the street parties, day and night tomorrow, but the morning after that, and the bin men redding up shredded pieces of palm trees like the debris of enormous wings. The gannet's eyes, the gannet's big clown face. A touch of yellow, and the town in yellow light. Close, damp, and heavy now with a storm coming. Shadows that latch the streets, and windows open where dresses flap and hang and never dry. A great sea-going birds, single blue egg. Now another poet who means a great deal to me and has done for many years is McNeice, a great Irish poet. But there were certain lines by McNeice that seemed to trigger something in the new book, both to do with the escape to a confined space, if you can think of it that way, and the measuring of time. In this case, the measuring of time in units of roughly 20 years. This, at least, is how I interpreted it. It's from a poem by McNeice written in 1940, when he was himself still a young man, about a young, an even younger American woman whom he'd taken up with in the States, Eleanor Clark. It's a fairly well-known poem, which is called Cradle Song for Eleanor. And the lines that I mean here are these: put off your 20-odd encumbered years and creep into the only heaven, the robber's cave of sleep. Those 20-odd years are ways in which you can measure experience, I suppose. Does it perhaps take 20-odd years to understand something that's happened to you? I don't know. But certainly the 20-odd interval recurs in various poems in this book. Notably, I think it recurs in the more conversational poems or more addressed poems that are slightly longer than the others and which kind of pepper the book. Each one addressed to a different person. And in each case, that person having, in one way or another, given access to material or information or perspectives that I could never come up with on my own. Each person addressed is a woman. It didn't really, that was not by design. And then when I added these up, I discovered that there were 9. My imagination being as classically steeped as I guess it is, it didn't take me long to think, my goodness, I've just accidentally encountered the 9 Muses and Mount Helicon. But when I use the term muse, by the way, as I do from time to time in this book, I think that deep admirer though I am of the lyric poetry of Robert Graves, I do not intend the Muses in exactly a Gravesian fashion, but perhaps in the more traditional way of the providers providers of inspiration, of knowledge, of skill. Now, that brings me to the McNeice connection in one of these poems. A poem called Mothers. It's a sort of bipartite poem. I'm going to read the second part of it, which is addressed to a friend who's also a very wonderful poet and very wonderful critic in the States, Rosanna Warren. And Rosanna's mother was Eleanor Clark, addressed in the McNeice poem. Eleanor turns up, by the way, in McNeice's The Strings Are False, a sort of wartime memoir that he produced of his life. She turns up there in disguise slightly, and he dreams of her right at the end of that text as a skater. The relationship with Louis was not a fortunate one, really. Eleanor herself went on to marry the American poet, the American writer, Robert Penn Warren, and also, as happenstance would happen, to have an affair with the mysterious Saint Jean Perse. Something I found out only after I'd written this poem, let me add. Anyway, I'll read the second part of Mothers. Peering like experts into the oven, we check on the vegetables and roasting salmon, till I turn, and there on the wall behind me is the face of the most beautiful young woman I already knew. She was 21 and orbiting close in to the Partisan Review when he collapsed in love with her, then wrote letters where his heart, brimming with ice, cracked into torrents. And you know all this, remembering her memories, how she had liked him well enough, but as our children might say, she just wasn't that into him. The apartment windows are Chicago at night time, but even this long away, we flinch. You sent me your poem about the snake, that great sum of small pain we absorb and move on from, which lessens us or doesn't, as the case may be. It's March and I'm shivering. I see you both at the end in Judith's photograph and imagine her hands clasped cold in yours. As a girl, she almost died once in the snow, but now her 20-odd encumbered years leave her to quarrel with the Irish poet about politics and how it all matters apart from love. When he dreams of her, she is a skater, and she has another name, dancing across the lake when the lake is frozen. Now, mention of Muses is really mention of inspiration, or really mention of where poems come from. Come, in my experience, unpredictably and unknowably. That, I'm 62 now, is just the same as it was when I was 20 odd years myself. And I did find myself pondering the unknowability of all this, the almost randomness of all this in the book, as poem after poem made for itself its own little room, whether you look at that in terms of shape, form, for want of a better word, or of imaginative scope, the small place that a poem can somehow or other illuminate, miraculously, to me anyway, sometimes illuminate. I'm going to read a 4-line poem. There are quite a lot of 4-line poems in this book. And I guess part of what I'm after there is, what shall I call it, an almost TARDIS effect of something that's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. I've no knowledge whether this works or not. I'm simply providing the rationale. And I'm going to read a short poem about poetry, about muses, which, as I say, is just a quatrain. It's called Tears. My first proper poem, 40 years ago, had muses in it. The muses were real girls. Real girls were muses. As if it was true, they were all crying as they walked in circles. Now, let me just say that poem, whatever else it is, isn't entirely a bluff. And to prove it, I suppose I'd better produce what I consider my first proper poem 40 years ago, but more than 40 years ago now, which came out in this little book from a Belfast publisher, yes, in 1982. And the poem would have been written a bit before then. So I wasn't quite 20 odd. You can just hear this. I hope it doesn't provide proof of a 40-year decline. Anyway, it was called Muses and went like this. One walks in a park where rain sifts over branches, younger and weaker than confidence or trust. Lost cars carry lights through the evening, and in the dark she kisses me and goes. Another wanders as though burdened with youth beneath some bare trees strung with coloured lights. A river glinting blue and green and red carries her into lies and poetry. And then another girl who will not speak. She staggers out of a bad dream, wounded, tired of all falsity and truth. Crying, she covers her eyes, turns her face away. And that little poem, for what it's worth, I don't know what it's worth, but that little poem is revisited from time to time in the new book. And indeed, I find myself quoting myself via St. John Pace again in a poem in the new book called Salt, which begins, "You stagger out of a bad dream, wounded." However, back to those muses in circles and the dance of the muses, a motif, whether you think of it as poetic or artistic, visual, a motif which I find fascinating. And it comes back in another one of these longer poems addressed to a woman, in this case a longer poem addressed to the very brilliant librettist and writer Alice Goodman, and written to Alice not that long after the lamented death of her husband, Sir Geoffrey Hill. I couldn't write an elegy for Geoffrey. Why, I don't know. I didn't feel the need, perhaps, to, nor had I felt the need could I have found the words. But the poem for Alice thinks of Geoffrey, and it thinks of him in ways that I think he needs to be thought about. I imagine him as in the phrase of a Renaissance English poet, the Latin phrase, the Musophilus, the lover of the Muses, which takes me to his love of barely controlled chaos in various contexts. And memories, I think, of my own teenage dancehall years somewhere. I shall read it. As I say, this is a slightly, these poems of address are slightly longer, but I hope I'll keep up. I hope we'll all keep up. This is called Tears of the Muses. They should probably form some kind of a ring, don't you think? They're moving in step together, and we half hear whatever they're singing, as if we each had only the one good ear, and that turned away. Of course, all the other noises just carry on with the crash and blare, with their buzz and fizz, their shrilling and pinging in some dimension beyond any sense. Yet that too is a thing to be made sense of. Between the music and the noise, the dance and the clumsiness of bodies falling down across each other, an over and above picture from the imagination drone, proves everything's all right. If you look there he is, trigged out in his courting gear on one side of the Muses' dance hall, shy as a flushed teenager or the class dunce, but ready to give it a go and ask. Between the Gorgon and the basilisk, something is turned to stone. And awkwardly he makes a play for poor Andromeda, or some such name, until you catch his eye, and there, behind the poker face, he's daring you to laugh. Martyr to musophilia, recited like a grim comic ground bass beneath that florid music, more or less, like one half of a joke in the routine. On his baseball cap, it says Musophilus. So that's us told. The dance starts up again, and it's all come and go, a sort of line dance, a take your partners for the do-si-do, to scrambling fiddles and a washboard, then blitzed zombies trying to put on a show with drums and snatches of deafening, virtuosic guitar that's strangling itself in feedback. Babel comes through as tinnitus. Within that sound, the notes of an old chapel hymn. So back we go now to a metrical psalm. But look twice, for all of them are crying where they move together, choking on the song, mouthing its words that must be beautiful if you're close up. And there he is, held in near to the circle, tripping without a fall, his arms stretched out, and their arms holding him. Well, I'd like to conclude by just covering another point in the book, which is that old point really of writing about one's own origins, which for me often has meant writing about my parents. I always think I've finished with that, and always something comes back to remind me. The parental poem is a genre, I guess, in itself, and one could think about that critically. I prefer to cling on to its creative potential, I think. There's a lengthy sequence in the poem, in the book, where I write about my late father, who died in 2002, but who was born in the same year as the state of Northern Ireland, the province of Northern Ireland. A sequence which I've called Centenary, a poem of 100 lines for those 100 years, where I think of two, about both my father and that country as in many ways late, and yet of course still active, at least in the imagination that one has. So that's one side of the parental thing. The other side, I suppose, is back to that word mothers, and the feature for me. Two, not having people around can be creatively stimulating, it must be said. It also throws one back on one's own resources, inner resources, the things that you can't tell them about, talk over with them, which for all of us are different things, and life throws all sorts of different things at all of us. During the period when I wrote this book, for example, I did something, by my standards, extremely dramatic, and quit my job. I didn't retire. Let me make that point. I quit my job at which I'd held for 25 years, really, at Christ Church, Oxford, simply because it was unbearable. Not the students, not the university, none of that. But having become a whistleblower in that institution and witnessed the most horrendous levels of bullying and borderline corruption, I blew the whistle successfully, in the sense that the Charity Commission pronounced, that there was something indeed wrong, and the institution was issued with a formal warning. But obviously, those responsible stayed on. But the one responsible for the whistleblowing has to go. I suppose I didn't have to go, but the point being, it was a big decision, and the psalms that are in this book are related to that. The psalm paraphrases, which contain pain and anger, but I hope also refine those things and get past those things indeed. So none of this could be shared with some of the people you most wanted to share it with. As one gets older, the sympathetic ears become fewer. Anyway, my mother, who died in 2017, didn't live to see any of that, and just as well. But I finally did produce a little poem, which I thought was adequate to something about this whole parental theme, about death enabling you in some ways to become the thing you miss. And it's a poem which I'll finish with. I hope fairly self-explanatory. It's called Travels. Now that I'm old, I'm the image of him. But she couldn't see my face, even close to hers, as she worried about her forgotten home and where it was. The windows and the doors all shut now, in her mind taken away to places she had never visited, driven by night without a reason why, to somewhere in the Free State to get rid of me. And coming back here in the end, she kept trying, but memory was no use in that last room. Did I ever have a house? Her questions were scared and delirious. Was I good? And did I have a husband? I looked at her with his face, and I said yes. Well, I hope that One Little Room provides some distraction and some enjoyment, and that at least some of what I've said helps open a few doors on what might and might not be going on there.